Here we go.
There we go. Hi, my name is Nancy Gazelle, and I'm the Museum Director for the Salvation Army Central Territory Museum located in Hoffman Estates, Illinois. I am a middle-aged white woman with shoulder-length dark hair and glasses, wearing a white button-down blouse, peach sweater, and navy blue blazer. The Central Territory Museum is located over by the Now Arena, formerly known as the Sears Center, off of I-90, so we're not too far away from the library. We're open to the public by appointment Monday through Friday from 9 to 3 p.m. Our website also features our digital museum, which includes articles and activities so that you can also visit us from any time from any digital enabled device. The Salvation Army Central Territory Museum is one of 5 Salvation Army museums across the country. The Salvation Army is an international organization with headquarters in its hometown of London, England. Our U.S. headquarters is located in Alexandria, Virginia, and then the country is further divided into 4 administrative sections called territories. We're located in the Central Territory, which oversees 11 Midwestern states. Each territory has its own museum, and our national headquarters has an archive and research center. When you think of the Salvation Army, most people know the bell ringers and red donation kettles that are out during this time of year. You may know our thrift stores, of course, and perhaps our emergency disaster services. Some of you may have enjoyed the hospitality of the Army while serving in the military, or have a family member with a great Salvation Army story. And sometimes these stories and traditions are passed through generations. Did you know that all of this comes out of the fact that the Salvation Army is a church? All of the good works and humanitarian aid that the Salvation Army offers come from its Christian values and its mandate to follow Christ's commission to help those in need. And these are its origins. Before we meet Edward Parker in the 19th century Elgin, I want to take a couple of minutes to set the scene and give you the backstory of the organization that Eddie found so appealing and of which he would one day become leader in the United States. The Salvation Army was established by William Booth in London in 1865. Booth's father, Samuel, was a self-made man. As William described him, he had been born into poverty. He determined to grow rich, and he did. He grew very rich because he lived without God and simply worked for money, and then he lost it all. His heart broke with it, and he died miserably. Not being able to afford the cost of school, 13-year-old William was apprenticed to a pawnbroker. Samuel died that same year. William's mother, Mary, was now a widow with 4 children. She chose not to remarry, which was a socially acceptable and common way for a widow to establish financial security for herself and her children. There were few career options in Victorian England for middle and upper class widows with children to earn a living and maintain their standard of living. And there were no social welfare programs to provide a safety net. Mary moved the family into more affordable housing and became a small business owner, opening a small shop which sold toys, needles, fabric, and other items. The Booth family, like many others at the time, was thrown into poverty. William was quite fortunate in that during his pawn shop apprenticeship and then brief pawnbroker career, he met friends and mentors who provided him with the opportunity to have a spiritual awakening, and then helped him to achieve his dream of becoming a Methodist minister. As you might imagine, William understood poverty. He saw destitution daily at work and experienced financial insecurity at home. He wanted his ministry to serve England's poorest people. But in life, we don't always get the jobs we want. William ended up serving as an itinerant minister, traveling a circuit which catered to working and middle-class congregations. Ultimately, he grew unhappy in this role and eventually broke with the Methodist Church. This allowed him to pursue the ministry he'd always wanted. He ended up becoming the leader of the East London Christian Mission, which catered to London's poorest people in the East End neighborhood. The plan was for William who was an excellent public speaker, to preach to the poor, and when the congregates were converted and became Christians, William would direct them to the established churches in the area. This did not go as planned. The congregations of these established churches didn't like the newcomers. They had strange mannerisms, wore dirty and ripped clothing, were a little rough around the edges, and smelled a little bit. They just weren't quite what the established parishioners expected. So the newly converted Christians came back to William and asked if they couldn't just join his church, where they felt that they belonged. William didn't intend to start an actual church, but he now found himself forming one. There were tons of missions in the East End trying to save souls, just like William Booth. Where he differed from the rest was the fact that he knew that when you have no idea where your next meal is coming from, if you can put clothes on your children's backs and a roof over their heads, that the physical needs overwhelm the spiritual aspirations, and that you must handle and address the physical before you can even begin to think of the spiritual. So as funds were available, over time, he began to offer clothing, cheap meals, cheap or free lodging, a penny bank, a library for his parishioners to educate themselves, and rehabilitation for those addicted to gin and opiates. This made William's mission a success. Eventually, in 1878, the mission changed its name to the Salvation Army, and the organization adopted militaristic branding and terminology to go along with the name. So churches are called corps, ministers are called officers, and they wear military-inspired uniforms. Instead of the titles of reverend or pastor, they use military ranks, including captain, lieutenant, and major, with the international head of the church using the title of general. Like the English Methodist Church from which it originated, the Salvation Army promoted a plain dress over the excesses of fashion, complete with abstinence from alcohol, and grew an existing rich musical tradition as a method of worship. Now, through all of this, William was very lucky. He had the perfect life partner to share his work. In 1855, he married Catherine Mumford, and they had 8 children. Catherine supported her husband's vision. She herself was a great theologian and one day felt called to preach, and William obliged. Catherine was a natural and became a very popular paid speaker while William was getting his mission off the ground in the East End. Catherine was preaching to well-to-do audiences who hired her to come and speak. This kept her and William, the 8 kids and the nanny, clothed, fed, and housed. Due to Catherine's influence and their very unique partnership, which did not reflect the male-dominated standards of the day, women have always had an equal role in the Salvation Army. After 35 years of marriage, Catherine passed away in 1890 after a long and difficult battle with breast cancer. By 1879, America had already heard of the Salvation Army. The name already appeared in papers nationwide. And a few Salvationists had already come to America to try and informally start the church here. It didn't go very well, though. In 1879, Eliza Shirley petitioned General William Booth to go to America and begin the work of the Army. Booth approved her request, but didn't expect this to actually go anywhere. So she was sent forward, but not in an official capacity. Eliza and her mother set sail to Philadelphia to join her father, who was already there with a job. The women had so much success, they formed 5 corps within a year. And this impressed Booth so much that he opened expansion to the first country outside of England, which was the United States, and sent a party of 8 to begin the work here officially. And this brings us to Elgin and to the Parker family. Throughout his lifetime, Edward Justus Parker viewed himself as a local boy from Elgin. His career took him to Chicago, Omaha, Mobile, Boston, New York, and other major cities across the Midwest, East, and South. He traveled extensively in Europe, even visited Hawaii and Jamaica. No matter where he was, his Elgin roots played heavily in his identity and his service. His lifelong identity as an Elginite is what inspired the title of this program. When I was talking with other museum staff members while researching this initially a year ago, one of my staff said, "Oh yeah, Eddie's like J-Lo." And it just suddenly clicked. While J-Lo identifies as Jenny from the Block, that really means Edward Parker had to identify as Eddie from Elgin. So since then, around the museum, he has been Eddie from Elgin. Edward Parker was born in Elgin on August 2nd, 1869, to George and Myra Parker. Eddie, as his family called him, was the middle child. Big brother Charles and younger sister Carrie Isabel rounded out the family. A second sister, Wilhelmina, lived only 14 days. George appears in the historic record as both a carpenter and a machinist. The family likely moved frequently. The 1870 census shows the Parkers living with Myra's parents in Elgin. By 1874, the family had moved to Rockford. Sometime between 1874 and her death in 1878, it appears that George and Myra split. What happened is unclear, but there is evidence in census records and the rare instance when Edward cited his father in legal documents that George left the family and eventually moved to the Pacific Northwest, where he died in either 1905 in Portland, Oregon, or in 1913 in Seattle, Washington. While their split does not appear in any records to have been legal as a separation or divorce, George and Myra might have ended their marriage in a way that can only be described as the Victorian DIY divorce. In the 19th century, legal separation and divorce were extremely expensive and not readily granted. Unlike modern no-fault divorce, a petition had to cite fault, and even then, a judge might still deny it. But America did not have the technology and tracking systems that we developed during the 20th century and certainly during the 21st. And it was still very possible for one or both marriage partners to move to a new community where nobody knew them, maybe change their names, maybe not, and start an entirely new life with a whole new family because nobody knew where they came from. There is no evidence that George may or may not have done this. There is no evidence that they got divorced or didn't get divorced. We just know that George suddenly leaves the picture. Unfortunately, this left Myra holding the bag because George left, but she stayed. And everybody in her community knew that she was married and they knew what happened. And while Elgin is a far cry from London, during the 19th century, they weren't dissimilar in that there were only select socially approved avenues for a single mother to earn a living. And there was no social safety net, and the boom and bust cycle of the Victorian economy could cause a family's entire life savings to vanish overnight. Myra Parker now experienced many of the same issues that Mary Booth also experienced decades earlier and an ocean apart. While Mary Booth entered the genteel profession of shop owner, Myra Parker pursued another socially acceptable career track, which was open but limited in its scope and opportunities to educated women. She supported her family through a career promoting temperance in the press and on the lecture circuit. Shortly before her death, Myra served as the associate editor of a periodical called The Helping Hand that was published out of Sycamore, Illinois. Years earlier, she had served as the state deputy director of the International Organization of Good Templars. The Good Templars were a fraternal temperance organization founded in the New York area in 1851, and they grew internationally, promoting peace and complete abstinence from alcohol. They are still active in the Fox Valley today, and while this group of Good Templars moved into the area in the 1920s, they were certainly active in the area as well when Myra was alive. Today, the local Templars own Good Templar Park in Geneva. And in his autobiography, Eddie recalled something very specific. He said, "When I was but 6 or 7 years old, I joined one of her organized groups of boys known as the Cold Water Army. With little wooden guns over their shoulders, we drilled in the Methodist Sunday school room, and upon being brought to attention, we raised our right hands and thereby pledging that cold water would forever be our beverage." Myra's Cold Water Army was the youth organization properly called the Cold Water Temples of the Good Templars. In May 1878, when Eddie was 8 years old, Myra became ill with peritonitis, which is an inflammation of the abdominal membranes and organs caused by rupture in the intestines, a burst appendix, or other significant medical event. Today, peritonitis is treated with antibiotics and often surgery. It is still a life-threatening condition. Myra passed away 6 weeks later at age 29. Eddie remembered the event vividly. "I can see her now as she lay in the front room of that little red brick cottage on Division Street and held her hand in mine, saying, 'Eddie, promise me that you will be a good boy and meet me in heaven.'" Myra's dying request remained with Eddie for the rest of his life and led him to accept Christ and become a Christian and a Salvationist. Myra's obituary noted that Mrs. Myra B. Parker was survived by 3 children, friends, and relatives. It made no mention of her husband, George. After her death, Myra's sister, Carrie Cole, took charge of the 3 children. Aunt Carrie and her charges moved with some frequency. The 1880 census showed them living with her father, Osmond, and her brother, Charles, in his family home. City directories show them residing at other addresses in Elgin during the decade. Aunt Carrie made sure that the 3 children regularly attended Sunday school. She did her best to keep them out of trouble, and Eddie was often kept after school, and Aunt Carrie came to his aid as she deemed appropriate. Eddie kept himself busy as a child. On top of school, from the age of 11 forward, he held a series of odd jobs, moving on to a new job when the old one had lost its charm. Eddie shoveled snow off of driveways and sidewalks, stacked firewood, hoed gardens, drove cows off to pasture along Poplar Creek, spent a summer harvesting cucumbers and potatoes on a farm in Crystal Lake, husked corn for the Elgin Packing Company, worked in a condensed milk factory in town, sold wild watercress door to door, despite not knowing that there was absolutely no market for this European delicacy in Elgin. And he held a paper route, which he sold to another boy due to the inhospitable nature of the local dogs. And he pumped the pipe organ at a local church 2 to 3 times per week, even though the organist often forgot her purse and was unable to pay him. His most profitable job was selling snacks, books, and newspapers on the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul rail line, which still runs through Elgin under its new Metro name, and earned him over $3 a day. All of this adolescent job hopping worried Aunt Carrie about his future. She felt that Eddie was too skinny and frail. She repeatedly told him that he would never amount to anything unless he earned a trade. He eventually took a job at a local printing company, earning $3 a week, which he left for the railroad gig, where he earned the same amount daily, but eventually returned to the trade and an apprenticeship in the printing department of the Elgin Daily News. The money he earned normally went to those things that boys in his era coveted: a pocket watch, a toy box camera, a toy engine, candy marbles, gingham shirts, fancy suspenders, and more. He also spent his earnings on violin lessons, although one turned out to be plenty, thank you, and drawing lessons for 50 cents per lesson. He and Charles went in together to buy a pair of chairs for Aunt Carrie's front room. Well, to us today, this is very odd to hear of a boy going to work at age 11 and largely being done with school not long after. In the 19th century, this was very normal for working class boys. High school, as we understand it, didn't exist until after 1900. Those children who were fortunate enough to continue their education after 8th grade were going to college or an academy where they were going to learn to be a lawyer, a doctor, or a minister. College, as we understand it, with an expanded social program, coeducation, and a greater array of degree options, was just barely starting to happen in the 1880s. And by the time you got your degree, you were 17 or 18 years old. So a 13-year-old kid was ready for a full-time job in Eddie's era. However, maturity came with its downside too. Teens were just as easily influenced in Eddie's day by their friends as they are today. According to Eddie, in a 1890 magazine article that he wrote about his life experience, his friends began to urge him to drink and leave the church. After Eddie's hitch in the Coldwater Army, he expected something quite different of the Salvation Army's bombardment of Elgin on Sunday, June 14th, 1885. Instead of the anticipated marching soldiers, guns, and drills, the army, he found, was a small group of people who began singing and playing a single tambourine in Fountain Square. The party included Captain and Mrs. William Evans, who oversaw Salvation Army operations throughout the Midwest and were headquartered in Chicago, and a local Elgin boy, Johnny Heather, who had moved to Chicago where he was converted and became a Salvationist. The concert was followed by a free and easy meeting at Mendelssohn Hall. It was announced that 2 female officers, Captain Blumel and Lieutenant May, would arrive in Elgin as leaders of the new corps. Eddie later reported that when he realized when they appointed 2 women to become the first officers at a corps, the Salvation Army meant business, because 2 women were far more successful at creating a lasting church than 2 men. He was always intimidated by following the ladies. The next day, both Elgin newspapers, the Daily News and the Courier, reported on the bombardment. The Daily News went on to define the role of the Salvation Army in its communities. It specified that the Army does not do business in opposition to the churches. Its object to reach the people whom the churches cannot reach. The article made it clear that the Salvation Army was not yet a functioning and defined as a Christian denomination in the United States. It was targeting the poorest in the communities it served and not competing with any local churches. The Daily News didn't seem to think that the Army would last long in Elgin. That the Elgin Corps will ever be a strong one is not probable. The class from which recruits are drawn is not numerously represented in this city. It will have no opposition here, however. People will give it kindly reception and wish it Godspeed in its work. The Army earned its first 2 converts, 2 train boys, the following week and held its first reported meeting on June 20th across the street from the Jennings Hotel. They rented space at the Academy of Music for 3 months. Charles and Eddie attended the meetings regularly. Soon after, Eddie was converted on his 16th birthday, and Charles soon thereafter. Their sister Carrie also became a Salvationist, an officer along with her husband, Daniel Black. Eddie was well versed in selling newspapers and turned his talents to selling the war cry to earn money for the Corps. He also became the Corps janitor. By the 4th of July, the Corps had grown. The Salvation Army is multiplying. There are 5 women, 2 children, 1 babe in arms, and a man parading about this week, shouting and playing a tambourine. In August, these parades would ultimately earn Eddie and 14 other Salvationists a night in the local jail. They were arrested for disturbing the peace. As the story goes, and as it was recorded in the Elgin Daily Courier News in 1974, Eddie tried his hand, unsuccessfully, at converting an inebriated man who was also in the lockup with him. "Now, brother," Parker extorted, "you see what sin has done for you." "What has it done?" was the sleepy voice drunk's reply. "Why, it's brought you to this prison." "But you're here too," he countered. "Yes," the Salvationist reasoned, "but I'm here for serving Jesus, and you are here for serving the devil." "Well," growled the drunk after a moment's hesitation, "you're here just the same." When Eddie felt called to become an officer, which is a Salvation Army pastor, Aunt Carrie was very concerned about yet another occupation, and again urged him to finish his printing apprenticeship and settle down to a stable job. But 16-year-old Eddie persevered and was accepted as a Salvation Army cadet. There was not yet a formal officer training program or a seminary to become a minister in the Salvation Army. When Eddie arrived at his first appointment in Janesville, Wisconsin on October 1st, 1885, 5 years after the Salvation Army began operations in this country, his training was on the job as an apprentice to the Corps officers. A series of Corps officer appointments and promotions followed, each after the standard 4-month term. Eddie's work took him to exotic places by his standards. His appointments in Sterling, Springfield, Joliet, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Mobile, Alabama. He'd always wanted to travel, and this was his golden opportunity. He was honored and terrified to be given the assignment of opening the South for the Salvation Army. His 4 months in Mobile were such a world away from what he had known that at first, Eddie thought he was going into missionary work. But soon enough, it was back to Minneapolis, where he was tasked with opening yet another corps. Eddie's appointments often required that he learn new skills and in a hurry. At age 20, he was appointed bandmaster for the Illinois Division Band, a prestigious appointment to be sure. Except Eddie didn't know how to read music. Over the past 4 years, he had taught himself to play the concertina, the cornet, and now he locked himself in his room to teach himself how to read sheet music so he could conduct a band. The band never knew his secret. He also taught himself to play the slide trombone since the band needed one more musician. As director of the Des Moines, Iowa Men's Training Garrison, which was the term that they then used for the newly established seminary program, Eddie had to develop a curriculum for the cadet students. This was surely an interesting challenge for a person who was trained on the job to develop a formalized seminary training program for new people. But 4 months later, he was tasked with moving the facility to Omaha, Nebraska, where he had to secure an appropriate building and equipment for the new school. As he rose up the ranks, the lengths of his appointments increased. While serving as a district officer, commander of the Massachusetts district, Eddie met and in 1891 married fellow officer Captain Ava Thompson. They were married for 68 years and had 6 children, 4 boys, Harold, Paul, Wallace, and Charles, and 2 girls, Mildred and Myrtle. Myrtle did not survive infancy. Aunt Carrie came to the rescue and left Elgin and moved in with the young family after the birth of their second child, Paul. She remained with the Parkers until her death in 1913 at the age of 77. She is buried in Elgin in Bluff City Cemetery. As National Trade Secretary, Eddie, now Brigadier Parker, revolutionized the production, supply, and products of the department. In this appointment, he was finally able to indulge in his love of photography and can be credited with implementing the widespread use of slides and motion pictures in Salvation Army ministry. While the money he earned in his job-hopping teenage years was largely spent on frivolous things, his purchase of a toy engine and box camera were highly influential in his career. Eddie was fascinated by how the engine worked and took it apart to figure out the mechanics. This self-taught engineering would serve him well. He also became entranced with photography, teaching himself the process of taking and developing photographic prints, slides, and motion picture film. He eventually built a darkroom in his home. Engineering and photography combined eventually as Eddie invented a new type of camera and a new type of motion picture camera, and he even published a book on the photographic process. Eddie's son Paul inherited his father's talent and passion for photography. Paul spent his career as a professional photographer for the Salvation Army, sometimes working with his father to document and promote the Army's work and service in communities across the country. Eddie's photography would serve him well in his appointment as Social Services Secretary, which he held for an unprecedented 28 years. Like his mother, Eddie was an excellent public speaker. He toured the country with illustrated lectures that he developed and created. Some of these presentations included tableau or other theatrical elements, in addition to photos and film to illustrate the concepts. He spent 2 years immersing himself in the life to bring attention to inner city poverty and documented the Army's service to the troops during World War I for a national audience. It was a natural extension of his appointment as the Social Services Secretary to include the needs of World War I soldiers in those his department served. As the United States entered World War I in 1917, Eddie added Salvation Army National War Secretary to his list of titles and was instrumental in the inclusion of the Salvation Army as an approved humanitarian aid provider to soldiers fighting overseas. It was this aid that would cement the Salvation Army in the minds of Americans as a valuable social services organization that could be trusted and depended on during times of need. Between 1917 and 1921, 244 Salvationist men and women served overseas, providing direct humanitarian aid to combat troops in France and Germany. First and foremost, the job of the Salvationists was to provide physical and spiritual aid and comfort. They operated hutments or huts. We might think of them as canteens. The huts regularly offered religious services and hosted clergy of denominations, including Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. This was one element that separated the Salvation Army huts from those of other aid organizations overseas. They welcomed everybody, no matter your background, your race, or your religion. When possible, huts provided record players and pianos, tables and chairs, along with paper and pens to write letters home. Live music and singing were common features in the huts. Huts offered a menu not found at the local camp kitchen. They provided coffee, hot chocolate, lemonade, cakes, cookies, pies, fudge, and quickly became famous for their donuts. In 1917, donuts were not something that you could find every day at your local grocery store or bakery. They were special treats that were made at home and sometimes, occasionally by the local baker on special donut days. When the Salvationists began making these deep fried delicacies in the middle of a war zone, to the doughboys who enjoyed them, it was a taste of home and a symbol that someone deeply cared about them. Soldiers without sewing skills could turn to the huts for uniform repairs. They even served as a Western Union of sorts, whereby soldiers could send their pay home. And when called upon, officers counseled the wounded and buried the dead. Salvationist women, nicknamed Donut Girls by the troops, were the face of the organization during the war and the chief proprietors of the huts. Salvationist men primarily drove the Salvation Army's fleet of ambulances, ferrying the wounded to medical care and transporting supplies. Most of the Donut Girls were trained nurses who had served appointments in the Salvation Army homes for unwed mothers. All of the Salvationists received advanced first aid training prior to their departure for France. When called upon, they served in triage centers, dressed wounds, and did what they could for the physical and spiritual needs of the dying. When Eddie's war work was largely stateside, securing locations and approval for huts that were located near training bases, he traveled to France from July through November 1918. to document the Salvation Overseas War work for a contract with the federal government. The images would also be used by the Salvation Army to promote this work. During this brief period, Eddie took over 1,000 photos and 8,000 feet of motion picture film. While this was the Great War, it was still a small world. Eddie hadn't even disembarked from the SS Niagara at its port in Bordeaux, France, when he was recognized by his son's high school teacher from New York. Before returning home, he would also bump into a Chicago newspaper reporter who happened to be an Elgin local and went to school with the daughters of his Uncle Charles. A small war indeed. Eddie was met in Bordeaux by Colonel William Barker, who was overseeing the Salvation Army's operations on the ground in France. Barker provided Eddie with a status report and sent Eddie on his way. Traveling under cover of darkness, he witnessed the conclusion of the Second Battle of the Marne, writing to Ava from the front at Ligny, France on August 5th, 1918. Eddie described the experience. "I'm sitting in a little shack just off the fighting front. Can hear the shells exploding as they go over our heads. We are waiting here for it to get real dark before we start to the front. We can only go in after dark, thus avoiding being seen by the Germans. In the distance, we see the flare of guns. Well, I found out what war is like, and I don't like it. It's awful, and every night, I pray most earnestly that this awful slaughter will soon be over." Eddie continued on, chasing the action from hut to hut under cover of darkness. He expressed his pride in the work that the Salvationists were doing for the troops. It was the donut and Eddie Parker that gave Salvation Army its first poster girl as well. Years after the war, Lieutenant Stella Young told a local newspaper about the day a photographer made her famous. During the course of a normal workday, Eddie walked into her hut where Stella and another female officer were working. Eddie was embedded with the United States Army Signal Corps, who were the official photographers to the war. His assignment was to take photos and film of Salvation Army War Service workers. Many of the photos featured in this presentation were taken by Eddie. Stella had never met him and had no idea who he was. She just knew he was a photographer. He asked her if she would take a few photos, and she obliged. Here's the two of them together. During the photo shoot, Eddie took one of the most iconic photos of the war, depicting a cheery, smiling Stella holding a tub of donuts. This photo was quickly circulated back home in the States and was used for postcards, sheet music, and more. Stella Young was a certifiable poster girl. But Eddie was irked by the view that donuts were the reason that the Salvation Army was so beloved during the war. He credited National Commander Evangeline Booth for the success. He felt that it was the Christ-like spirit of our people, not the donut. It was the commander's leadership that made the outstanding achievement of the Salvation Army possible. Upon returning home, Eddie had trouble escaping the donut's fame. After the war, he was charged with renting a building to serve as a temporary national headquarters while the permanent national headquarters was under construction. He found a suitable building for rent and began to negotiate with the owner. He recorded the incident. After listening to my request, he replied, "My only boy wrote me from France." Here we go with those donuts again, I thought. "Dad," wrote my son, "if you will ever have a chance to help the Salvation Army, don't pass it up. They are wonderful people and have done so much for me over here." In 1927, Eddie's run of 28 years as the Social Service Secretary ended as he received a new appointment. Eddie was now the Chief Secretary. Today, this position is called the Territorial Commander for the Eastern Territory that includes Ohio and the Northeastern states. This new appointment placed him in command of the whole territory. It turned out to be preparation for his next and final appointment as National Secretary, now called the National Commander. Eddie had now become the leader of the Salvation Army in the United States. The role of the national headquarters was also evolving with the title, to become a clearinghouse for the 4 U.S. territories and coordinating administrative matters. Eddie felt that the biggest surprise of his career was being elected president of the 1939 High Council. This body is made up of all the commissioners or territorial leaders from around the Salvation Army world. They are convened in London as needed for the purpose of electing the next general, who is the head of the Salvation Army Church. As president, Eddie was recognized by his peers as a person with great integrity who could lead the council through their deliberations and prayer as they selected their new leader from amongst the council members. It was a great honor indeed. That same year, war clouds again began to form as Europe now entered yet another conflict. By September 1940, the United States implemented its first peacetime draft and was gearing up to enter the war. In his autobiography, My 58 Years, Eddie wrote, "I want to discuss with him, Central Territory Commander Commissioner Ernest Pugmire, the question of what he thinks to do in serving thousands of soldiers now leaving home for military training. In the journey I've just taken across the 3,000-mile span of this great country, I have seen them from my train window. I have seen them at the railroad stations. America is building up her army for national defense." Pugmire was already ahead of him and was starting to jockey for hut property at Camp Grant in Rockford, Fort Sheridan north of Chicago, and Camp Custer near Battle Creek, Michigan. The aid organizations who provided humanitarian aid to the troops during World War I had remained friendly during the interwar period. They often celebrated Memorial Day together, here shown laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldiers in Arlington National Cemetery. Now in New York, former World War I military chaplain and Salvation Army Colonel John Allen was working to unite them again for a common cause. He arranged a meeting. One meeting became several, and 6 organizations united into the United Services Organization, the USO, which was incorporated in New York in 1941. The participating organizations were the Salvation Army, the Young Men's Association, the Young Women's Christian Association, Catholic Community Services, the Jewish Welfare Board, and the Travelers Aid Society. Each organization would operate USO facilities across the country. Eddie was recognized as a USO founder and elected to the board of directors, serving on multiple USO committees. During World War II, the Salvation Army operated 201 USO clubs between 1940 and 1941. This is in addition to its existing Red Shield Club program. The Red Shield Clubs were an international program for military personnel which began in England during World War I. During that same period of 40 to 47, the Salvation Army operated 210 Red Shield Clubs nationwide. Now, National Commander Edward Parker retired in 1943, handing the mantle over to a new generation of Salvationists. His legacy included the establishment of the USO, using photography and film to bring the work of the Salvation Army into American homes, and embracing emergent technologies to support ministry. Eddie returned to his hometown from time to time. Notably, he took a vacation day from forming the USO for a nostalgic visit to reminisce about how far life and his faith in God had taken him. On October 1st, 1940, marking the 55th anniversary of his departure from Elgin and the start of his Salvation Army career, Eddie strolled around town, past his old haunts, including the church where he used to pump the organ for the organist who often forgot to pay him for his services, through Fountain Square, where he noted that the fountain had now been replaced by a thermometer, the home where he had lived when he left for his journey to the Salvation Army in 1885, and the most important place of all, the home in which his mother had died. Playing out front, he met the current 8-year-old resident, a boy the same age as he was on that life-altering night. He asked the current homeowners for a tour and sat in the front parlor for a time as he thought about his mother. After a long 58-year career, 53-year career, Eddie's sister and brother-in-law, the Majors Daniel and Carrie Black, were separated when Daniel passed away in 1945 at age 74. Carrie retired to Elgin, where she was cared for by a nephew. She passed in 1949. They are interred in Geneseo Cemetery in Valhalla, New York. Eddie and Ava spent their golden years in New York. She passed away in 1959 at age 89, and Eddie in 1961 at age 91. They are also buried in Geneseo Cemetery in Valhalla. The Elgin boy, who held so many odd jobs, was called into a ministry perfectly suited to his ability to rapidly change tasks and master new skills. Edward Parker's love of God and promise to his late mother defined his life and gave him purpose. He often wished that Aunt Carrie could see the culmination of his 58-year-long career and hoped that she would approve. Thank you so much for enjoying Eddie's story with me, and I will stop sharing, and I hope that Sadia might be able to help me take a look